Command Share, brought to you by Star City Games. I'm your host, Sheldon Menery, founding member of the Commander Rules Committee. I'm joined each episode by a rotating cast of colleagues from the RC, members of the Commander Advisory Group, or perhaps other luminaries from Commander circles. Each episode, we break the show into two blocks. First, in the Command block, we talk about the RC's high-level decisions and what we're most recently discussing, the things that are going on sort of at the format level. Then in the Chair block, we lean back, talk about playing the game, the cards, the decks, the technology, and all the things that the RC brings to bear in the kind of games that we like to play. Today, I'm joined by fellow RC member Toby Elliot. Toby, have a seat in the Command Chair.
Thanks, it's great to be back.
So everybody knows you as sort of the rules person on the RC. What do folks not know about you that you'd like to tell them, or would like them to know?
Let's blow your mind. If you do a search for Toby Elliott Drunk Trek, you will find probably the most famous and certainly most convoluted Star Trek drinking game of all time.
Okay. Now, is that you or some other Toby Elliott?
No, it's me, and the reason Sheldon is boggled by this right now is that I don't actually drink.
Right.
So, I technically did at the time, but yes, this was 20 odd years ago, during the height of Next Generation, and I was involved with a group of people who had taken over essentially a very simple version of the Star Trek drinking game rules and turned it into a super hyper complicated version of the Star Trek drinking game rules.
All right, give us the nickel tour of the rule set.
It's got about six major sections, a couple hundred rules, and basically, if you actually slavishly follow it, you will be thoroughly inebriated about 15 minutes into an episode.
Well, that's every drinking game, right?
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah, they always have no place good to go.
No, but I mean, we designed it so that the rules themselves were fun to read. They're essentially gently mocking of all of the Star Trek tropes and cliches, and you drink every time some primitive alien species gets, the better of the Next Generation crew, and all the stuff that you expect. All the sort of things where you're like, oh yeah, they did that again. Drink.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the first 3 seasons, Mr. Worf existed just so that he could get beaten up by other aliens.
Oh yeah, that's on there.
Okay, so what music do you want to tell folks that they should be listening to while they're building their decks and have us playing?
Wow. So I actually spend most of my time listening to Pandora stations nowadays. So I'm not sure I could recommend a specific genre. Well, I mean, I listen to stations. What I tend to do is throw in... Pandora's amazing. It's free. Everybody should try it because it will broaden your musical horizons in really interesting ways. What I did is, I have fairly weird taste in music. I tend to favor sort of odd synthesizer musics from mid-2000s and early 80s new wave acts. And so I threw, I think it was Freeze Pop and Thomas Dolby into a Pandora station. And it started spouting out all these groups that I'd never heard of, that some of which are now my absolute favorites. If you want a specific song that I'm obsessed over and listening to a ton, Royksop, Royksopp, they're Running to the Sea is something I'm listening to constantly while building decks. It's kind of amazing. But yeah, I just throw in a Pandora station and make notes when something comes up. I'm like, I've never heard this before. Who's it by?
Interesting. That, of course, is not a paid sponsorship from Pandora.
It is not a paid sponsorship for Pandora. I'm not even a paid member of Pandora, although I feel like I probably should be the amount I use it. So I'll probably be throwing money at them at some point.
Yeah. All right, let's move into the command block. We're going to talk this episode about dies triggers. So we recently announced a change to the way that commanders work with dies triggers. You can read all the deep rules details on the website. That's mtgcommander.net. But the short version is that commanders hit the graveyard briefly before then going to the command zone.
That is pretty much the accurate short version. They also hit exile briefly before going to the command zone.
Right.
Basically, any public zone they hit, things now trigger the way you think they should based on how they work for every other creature.
So it's a state-based action, right? So
it is a state-based action.
So if your commander is in exile or the graveyard since the last time we checked SBAs, then you can put it in the command zone. And
yeah, and we had quite the long and convoluted process to get there.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's get into the weeds a little bit on that, because you and I were both relatively deeply involved in the change at an atomic level.
Sure.
Let's talk first about what precipitated the change.
Well, so this is a rule that had been we had a very simple replacement effect in place for commander for many, many years, which was essentially if your commander would go pretty much anywhere, you can put it in the command zone.
Right.
That had huge advantages in terms of it was very simple rule for people to follow. It was pretty simple to explain. Where it wasn't great was that it produced a few really unintuitive results, where it wasn't merely, oh, that's a quirk of commander, it's that feels like a hack.
Right.
And so that was the first major consequence. The second major consequence was that Wizards had real problems making legendary creatures with conventional, if this creature dies, do something. Now, because this was so simple and it worked, and it only had sort of these weird hacks and corners that you had to be sort of rules guru-ish to realize, we didn't have a lot of impetus to make this happen. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that we didn't like the idea. People would be like, oh my gosh, you gotta make Commander's Death Triggers work. We'd be like, yeah, maybe. This is one where we don't feel all that strongly. You'll never find us arguing online, oh yes, this is absolutely the correct rule, it must be this way. My general response was, this is actually a lot harder than it looks.
Right.
We like Commander rules to be simple and intuitive. There's a little more wiggle room if the implementation is a little more complex, but the actual result is simple and intuitive.
Uh-huh.
But still, we like, the Commander rules should be able to fit on one of those little Legends rules cards. So this was one where we're like, it's good enough. We're reasonably happy with it. We're okay.
Well, a big part of that was we liked the idea that the replacement effect just was a blanket, right? That everything was a replacement effect. You didn't have to worry about figuring out which was which. So
yeah, exactly.
Goes to the library, hand, whatever.
Yeah, it has certain advantages, and we talked about this for years.
Yeah.
I mean, every year or so, somebody would say, "What about death triggers?" And we're like, they're kind. I mean, they work, and they're kind of a mess to fix. It turns out, you do the obvious things, and bad things start to happen. We'll talk about some of the alternatives that we proposed and we talked about, and why that we didn't go with them. We had 8 alternatives on the table, I think, at one point.
Something like that. There was a sheet.
There was a sheet. I had a big document, and there was space for comments, all the rest of it. But the key part here is that it wasn't that we felt the rule was right. It's that we felt the rule we had right now was fine.
Yeah.
And the CAG kind of changed that, because the CAG had a much stronger opinion that, as us as very rules-focused people who really know what we're doing, and inside the rules quirks like that don't really bother us. Or, the fact that, Elenda doesn't work when she goes to the graveyard, it's fine. It doesn't.
Right.
It's just how the rules work.
Right.
Whereas the CAG were like, from a gameplay perspective, we really believe that this is, this is wrong, this is weird, and it's unintuitive, and everybody has to explain it. And I think the tipping point for me was, especially within the CAG, but also without the CAG, we got a lot more evidence that people were actually playing it wrong.
Right. There's a certain intuitiveness to the idea that, well, my commander's dying, I don't care where it ends up, but my commander's dying, so this thing should trigger. So there were a lot of folks that that played it that way because that's the way they thought that it should work. That was the way that resonated with them when they were playing the game.
Exactly. And so we started to see a lot more evidence that the population in general, especially like the lower invested players who weren't like Magic rules gurus, were already doing this. And that gave us more impetus to say, okay, if in a situation where the rules are fighting with what everybody's thinking they should be doing, maybe we'll take another run at it. And I don't mind taking runs at this. This is the sort of rules tinkering that I like to do and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I went off and I started pondering, okay, all the different ways we could do it. And I started writing them down, and then we started coming up with, well, what are all the cards that have weird interactions? And we didn't get all of them. We got most of the major categories.
Sure.
Down to like weird stuff. Like there's at least one of the 7 or 8 versions we had where, well, this is fine except it interacts really weirdly with Skullbriar.
Yeah.
Which is like, That's going deep.
Right.
And it happens that Skullbriar is one of my former commanders, so it's a card that's near and dear to my heart. So I do think about it a bit. But yeah, we basically went there and we threw out every possible conceivable one, and all of them have weird trade-offs. Some of them are very, very simple, and the one that I'll give you an example right now. The one that everybody immediately says, well, here's the obvious way to fix it, is you just redefine the word dies to means is put into a graveyard or the command zone.
Right.
And we had that one. We considered that one. It has the advantage of being really, really simple. It sounds really intuitive.
Sounds being the operative there.
What it actually does is it turns every dies trigger onto a commander into a leaves play trigger.
Yes.
What that functionally means is if I blink my commander, it will trigger.
Yeah.
Which was really weird. If I bounce my commander, it will trigger if I wanted to. That was a little less powerful.
And obviously you can see how that goes down a pretty bad road with breaking a few cards.
I'm not, the breaking's fine. If it was awful that we had to ban a card or two, that would have been okay. But it actually was awful, and we would have just had a miserable time because blinking your commander is just a super, super value strategy at that point.
Right.
Because what happens, for those who don't follow along, is that when you blink your commander, because there's the replacement effect, it replaces going into exile with going to the command zone, and then yoinks it back a moment later.
Because the ability can still track it, because there's not an additional zone change that happens, and we'll talk about that a little more in the share block as we talk about individual cards.
Yeah, and so the net effect here was that we had another rule that was simple, but it wasn't intuitive, because what would happen is the first time you sat down and somebody blinked their commander or bounced their commander and was like, and Child of Alara triggers and blows up your board, you'd be like, wait, what? No, that's not what it says at all.
Right.
So we couldn't simply, the problem with that one, and this is the way it happened, is all of these rules we had were like, well, this one's great, but it does this bizarre thing.
Well, the one that I strongly objected to from the get-go was the one where the commander had to leave the graveyard, that you didn't have an option to stay in there. I'm like, no, strategically that's a cool thing where you get your commander to the graveyard and do stuff with it, as opposed to having to recast it from the command zone.
Yeah, that one had some huge advantages as well. It removed the strategy, but it also removed the weird. So what that did is it was essentially a state trigger that said anytime your commander's in a zone other than the command zone or the battlefield, you can move it to the command zone. And so it would re-trigger constantly if you needed it.
Which would close the Mind Slaver loop.
It would close all sorts. It closes the New Oblivion Ring loophole, for example.
Yeah.
It has those advantages. It was a fairly simple rule to write.
Mm-hmm.
It got around the stifle problem in that we had at least one trigger that wasn't a state trigger, where it was just if your commander would go to the graveyard, or when your commander goes to the graveyard, put it in the command. You may put it in the command zone.
Mm-hmm.
Problem with that one is things like stifle and things that can yoink it out beforehand, and so all of these things had weird rules interactions. And the advantage of the state trigger, for example, was that it didn't have that problem where you could stifle a trigger and leave your commander in the graveyard forever. Mm-hmm. But of course, that had the additional strategic problem of, well, now you can't leave your commander in the graveyard. Is that an acceptable casualty of this? So this was all a question of, weighing off the trade-offs and weighing off what would happen in various scenarios. Mm-hmm. A personal quote-unquote favorite of mine was, we had this one stuck on at the end that literally had the note attached that said, ask Charlotte or Toby how this works. It essentially desynchronized your commander so that when it died, you made a token copy of the commander that went to the graveyard, and your commander went to the command zone. And I'm like, that does really weird things with cards that care about tokens dying.
Yes.
So everything, there wasn't a magic bullet here.
Yeah.
We were not going to be able to produce a result that would let people say, oh, it all just works magically intuitively and there's no strategic changes, mm-hmm. and everything is great, let's move on. If we'd had that, we'd have changed this years ago.
One of the big impetuses of the change, I think, was we started talking about it more because Rules Manager Eli Schifrin's desk was right behind mine in Studio X. So it would come up. We would start talking about rules and stuff. And as this thing happened, I was like, "Oh, Eli, I know that you and Toby have been talking, so let's talk about this more." And it was really Eli that got us onto the idea that we finished with.
Yeah, no, Eli was a big help at the end, and we'll get to that story in a bit when we sort of talk about what we did with Wizards. And it's worth pointing out to people, things move slowly. We were having these discussions last October, yes. I think. So, getting on towards a year ago. We probably had the text we mostly liked December-ish.
Yeah.
Things move slowly when you have a lot of people to coordinate. You got to make sure that everybody's on board. You have to make sure the CAG's are good with it.
Yep.
You have to make sure Wizards knows that it's coming. You have to prepare the announcements and planning and all the rest of it. Like, there's a lot to be done there.
Yeah, and there were a lot of online polls probably from the middle of last year were like, make Commander Death Triggers work. And of course, we can't go, yes, we understand, we're working on it. You can't spoil what's happening behind the scenes. So we just kind of had to shut up and take our beatings when people were like, Commander Death Triggers are stupid.
Well, I got the other side, which was, hey, you can it should be really easy to make this work. I'm like, no, it's really hard. And I'm actually thinking, we've done it. I had Twitter people saying, you should do it this way. I'm like, yeah, it turns out all these things are really complicated and, there's lots of side effects, which was true, but slightly inaccurate. I never outright lied and said, no, we're not interested. I would simply say, this is a lot harder than it looks.
I think that's a very common misconception among, the sort of moderately enfranchised part of the player base that things are easy, that the word just comes up a lot. Well, you just do this, or you just do that. And solutions aren't just that easy.
Yeah, the Magic rules are a really complicated document, and they're very mathematical.
Yeah.
So if you tweak how a part of a formula works, it has cascading effects across the entire thing, and people are discovering that now. Even with what we felt was probably the lowest impact, both strategically and rules-wise approach. People are now discovering, and we'll talk about the various cards that this interacts slightly weirdly with, but they're suddenly discovering, oh yes, Oblivion Ring actually works in a slightly dangerous way.
Right.
There is no way to just change Magic rules and have everything magically work, especially when you're messing with something so fundamental to Magic as state-based actions and stuff going to graveyards and really fundamental game effects. I mean, if you want to, for example, change the companion rules to add 3 mana cost to how they cost, you can do that without a lot of consequences elsewhere because you're just sort of messing with a mechanic.
Right.
Here you're messing with like fundamental game actions.
Right.
And there's no way to do that without some sort of something. Other threads have to get pulled essentially.
Yeah,
until you get to a place you like.
There's a reason that there's no printed copies of the Magic rules because it's like 230 pages long or something.
And outdates itself every few weeks.
Right.
I mean, there are people with binders and printed copies, and they'll pull out pages and put new pages in, but then they discover, well, that actually just cascaded in 105 pages now have, moved 3 lines down.
Right. It becomes really messy.
It's a task for the devotees, to put it mildly.
Right.
There's a nice text version. I mean, one of my pet peeves is that the URL for the text version of the comprehensive rules changes every time they put up a new one.
Uh-huh.
There's not a single link I can just bookmark where I can just go click on the comprehensive rules and it gives me the current version.
Oh, I got you. Yeah.
I would love, please Wizards, please give me a single link to the text version of the comprehensive rules. Or at least a redirect, something, anything.
Now you're old enough. When you say text, you mean text, right?
I mean, yeah, plain text. It's just more searchable.
Right. In the last 12 months, how many different scripts have you written that will search out something in the comprehensive rules?
Oh, none.
Oh.
Now ask me how many scripts I've written that will search out card text databases, and it's a higher number. Yeah, no, the comprehensive rules you're just control Fing for various terms that you're worried about for some rules change you want to make, or somebody asks you a question, you need to go and find the exact rule for how interaction of continuous effects works in this scenario, and so the it's very useful just because you will want to look for certain terms. And while building this, I was command Fing for a lot of the dissections of the rules and the replacement infections and the state-based actions, the state triggers, making sure I had function. I mean, even when we presented to the CAG, it was important to me that I presented rules that would actually work as rules, because I didn't want the CAG to evaluate a rule and then we had to change 2 words and it actually really changed the meaning and the effect of what it did. And in fact, the rule we have ultimately gone with, we didn't come up with through this process. What we came up with was a rule that was a state-based action, but we said if your commander would go to the graveyard, you may put it in the command zone. If you don't, and it doesn't have a choice counter on it, you may put it in the command zone. If you don't, put a choice counter on it. And that was our way of implementing, you made the conscious choice to leave it in the graveyard. So that's what we took to Eli. And Eli's like, well, this is fine, this will work. But Death Touch has this terminology, and I never would have thought to look at the Death Touch rule for this. But Death Touch says if a creature on the battlefield was damaged by a Death Toucher since the last time state-based actions were checked, it dies. Which means that you get around issues like creature having indestructible getting hit by a Death Toucher, and then later on it loses indestructible or something, and nothing weird happens at that point. But we're like, oh, wait, so you can just say, you can have a rule explicitly refer to state-based actions themselves. At which point it was like, oh, well, we don't need the counter, then you just, if it went to the graveyard since the last time state-based actions were checked. And this is also where the trade-offs come in my mind. From a rules-E perspective, the new rules are borderline too complex for my liking. It was actually fine up to this point. Then when we had to split it out into separate library exile ones, I think it sort of went over the border where I was this is more complicated than I really wanted. I was okay with it mostly because it all worked intuitively. It all worked the way things should work, but having to talk about things like, you never want, the old replacement rule, you could just say it would go to the graveyard, instead it goes here. That's English understandable. If it would go to the graveyard and state-based actions have last been checked, yada yada, people are like, what are state-based actions? And you have to be like, don't worry about it. They're fine.
Well, as soon as you start getting into the subordinate clauses and the conditionals, it gets a little trickier.
Yeah, so the rule we have on the Commander website isn't going to start talking about things like that. It's not. It's going to be more colloquial. It'll be less accurate. And there are rules on for people who don't understand that the rules on the Commander website are not designed for technical accuracy. They have errors pointing out to us, oh, this actually doesn't match the comprehensive rules. That's fine. We actually are totally okay with that. The rules on the website are designed like the Magic basic rules. When you first start playing Magic, you don't go read the comprehensive rules. That would be madness. You probably don't even go read the 28-page basic rulebook. But the 28-page basic rulebook is designed to let you answer 99% of all rules questions in plain English. And so the Commander website is designed the same way. It's if you are wanting to get going with Commander and just, how's this work? Here's the rules card size rules of what it does. And you don't need to know about state-based actions. You don't need to know about all the various details about color identity and backfaces and all these things that you probably will not encounter during this time.
During when you're first getting
when you're first playing Commander. And should you need to go and look one up, by the time you're at the stage where you're looking up rules, you know about the comprehensive rules and can go look them up. Almost always when I have a disagreement with somebody about the rules on the Commander website, it's somebody who's like, but it doesn't match CR 906.3, and I'm like, and the fact that you know what CR 906.3 is means this is working. So anyway, from that perspective, the rules themselves are more complicated than I would like. They don't translate directly into nice, clean English that we can tell everybody. And that to me is a trade-off. Like especially once we were like, and now we have to have 2 rules. And we had, Eli and I went back and forth for a while on could we actually have a single state-based action for everything. Eli was a lot more down on that than I was. Let's put it that way. I think it could have worked, but we would have to lean fairly heavily into the idea of commanderness is the property of a physical card. Because you have to be able to pull a face-down card out of a library to make it work.
Right.
A library that may have been shuffled.
Yep.
So the game technically has lost track of, well, where is this card? It's now an anonymous card inside the library. If you treat it as this card has a special marker attached to it, its commanderness, sort of think of it as a glowing halo, I think you could probably have gotten away with saying that. It also had some weird physical representation because if we had the state-based action applying to the library and you cast Chaos Warp on your commander, technically what happens is the commander gets shuffled into your library, you reveal the top card of your library, which might be your commander, you then go in and get your commander out, but of course in order to do that you've now looked at your library, so you have to shuffle again.
Right.
Now, mechanically that's fine, and you can hand that away that way with sort of, it's not technically a shuffle, but you need to randomize your deck that was previously entirely randomized once you pulled out your commander. But then people start asking about psychogenic probe and all the other things that trigger on a shuffle, and I'm like, no, that shuffle doesn't actually exist. It's just a game practical standpoint, and having to explain that was sort of like, okay, you win, Eli, let's go with the replacement.
And again, you see, I think that's just further example that nothing is simple, right?
No, nothing is simple.
Nothing is simple. You have to see, and Magic players are really smart, and they're going to find those corner cases but if you do that, this is the way, either this is the way I have a problem with it, or this is the way I'm going to abuse it, or this is the thing that's going to confuse me.
Right. So from an explanation standpoint, it's a little more complicated. The reason, and again, I'm definitely the RC member who's on the we must keep the rules simple and elegant, etc. But I signed off on it because the number of times your commander goes to your library or goes to your hand, and there's a difference between the replacement effect and the state-based action, is approaching nil.
Yeah.
It's if you have a commander with a leaves play trigger. I'm not even sure there is a commander with a leaves play trigger. I'd have to go hunt.
Nothing occurs to me off the top of my head.
Right. So there's incredibly bizarre corner cases. And I'm fine with, if 1 in every 1,000 commander games something comes up where that distinction matters,
then we deal with it. Yeah.
That's fine. I mean, there are far bigger problems that come up more than once in 1,000 commander games that,
right,
than a little slightly unintuitive rule.
And that goes, that sort of goes back philosophically for us, that you write rules for the primary use cases, not for the corner cases.
Exactly.
You issue,
you make sure the corner cases aren't horrible,
right?
But
you issue interpretations on the rules to go with the corner cases. You don't make a whole rule set because of them.
Yeah, I mean, we the other thing, of course, that was not acceptable is we were not going to hand wave anything.
Right.
I know this came up in the companion discussion with people like, oh, the RC's just hand waving companions to make it work, and I'm like, no, wait, we're going to release the rules and it'll be fine. They're like, no, you're hand waving. We release the rules. They're like, oh, I guess that kind of works. But we will never do. It just works.
Yeah.
Don't pay no attention to us.
It does. That does a couple of things. Rulings by fiat just sort of undermine your own credibility, for one, and then they make things confusing. It's like because you have to be constantly plugged in and paying attention to what the person issuing the rulings has to say. And back in the ancient days of Magic, even before you were involved, that was basically how it was. In 1994, 95, 96 even, there was a rules manager, and he's like, well, this is the way it works. And explanation was, well, that's because I'm the rules manager and I say it works that way.
It was Bethmo.
No, it was Tom Wiley before that.
Oh, Tom, that's right, Tom. Oh, wow. Yeah. Remember, I've been playing since 93.
Yeah,
93.
You weren't so heavily invested back then, though.
Yeah. but I was following. I mean, if you were playing Magic back then, you had to read Tom Wiley and then Beth Mo's rule summaries because you couldn't actually play the game under the rules of Magic. There were just way too many weird corners that were not addressed. And the big thing about the 6th edition rules is that they went and they said, we're going to make a mathematically sound structural thing that accounts for everything. And if it doesn't work with a card, we're going to errata the card to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, it was the Wild West for a long time. I mean, even into the late 90s, I remember being at, I'm pretty sure it was a European Championship, and there were 2 level 4s and 7 or 8 level 3s, which was a significant portion of the high-level judges in Europe at the time. We were on the stage night before the event started. I don't even remember what the question was, and we had divided into 2 camps. As a matter of fact, we were having this argument, and we had slowly physically divided into separate areas of the stage, and we're having this argument back and forth. And finally, I think it was Thomas Bisbala, who was a level 4 from Denmark, said, "Well, why don't we just call Bethmo?" It might be midnight here, but that means it's 4:00 in the afternoon in California. So we got Bethmo on the phone. She sorted it out, but you don't want to live in those days, especially at high level.
Was that Wall of Boom?
No, no, that wasn't Wall of Boom. That was, I'd have to really, really search my memory to figure out what it was. All right, I think we've hit the rulesy bit of the Commander Dies triggers. Any last attacks you want to throw at that?
No, I mean, obviously we'll get to it in the cards and stuff, but we'll tweak these rules if we think we actually need to. But I think they're in a pretty good place right now. Like I said, they're a little more complex than I like, but they are really intuitive, and we're excited to see. Right now, there's not that many cards with Dies triggers, but we have heard from the team inside WotC R&D. They're like, "Oh my God, we are so ready for this now.
We can do this." Right.
So I'm actually kind of excited to see what this does 6 months, a year from now, when the output of the rules changes really start to impact what they're doing. I mean, they've known that this is coming for 6 months now, but they work a long time ahead. And so there'll be some. The first few, there'll be just a trickle of ones where they had a Leaves Play trigger, and maybe now it's a Dies trigger, maybe it's not. And then I think there's going to be there'll be an entire theme of Commander Dies triggers, the pre-constructed decks or something.
Well, I mean, we saw Gerard was sort of a hack. The new Gerard was sort of a hack to get around that. And my question was, at the time was, well, why don't we just keep doing this? And a number of my colleagues in Series X were like, because it adds too many words to the card.
Yeah, and Rayhan's the same way. There's a lot of cards that it's clear they were trying to figure out a way to give commanders Dies triggers, and it wasn't really working. So I think they're super excited, and right now there's 8 or 10 commanders that this affects. In 3 years' time, they'll be triple that easy.
Who knows?
I'm sure.
Yeah, we look forward to figuring out and finding out what they come up with.
Yep. It's exciting.
Right. Time to move into our brief interlude. It's called Hidden Gems. So the folks that come on the show have been playing the format for a long time. We play cards that some players might not have ever heard of. So we discuss those cards in each episode in our feature segment that we like to call Hidden Gems. Toby, what's your card this time?
So I'm picking a card that the first time I ever played it against you, you mocked me for. And immediately after that game, it became Kill on Sight. No, not Vicious. No, not Vicious.
I thought it was going to be Vicious Shadows.
No, although I did think about it.
You were roundly mocked at the table for playing Vicious Shadows, and then you killed us all, and we saw the light.
Yes. Well, you all had so many cards in hand. That was your fault. No, the card I'm going for today is a green enchantment from Urza's Saga called Fecundity.
Oh, yeah.
And Fecundity has very simple rule text. It essentially just says, whenever a creature dies, its controller draws a card. Now, nowadays, in green, drawing cards isn't quite what it was. I mean, there's a lot of green card draw, and But back then, green really struggled. But green also made a ludicrous number of tokens.
Right.
I had an Ulash deck that was devoted to making all the tokens. I've liked playing token decks. I built a token deck back in Legends days using Serpent Generator and the Hive. Back when tokens were really, really bad.
Well,
so I love making tokens.
The tokens were good. They were just really expensive.
Well, they weren't good. They were a 1/1 flyer and a 1/1 poison, I think, or something terrible. Yeah, they were terrible. But I still liked making tokens.
Sure.
So Fecundity would draw me. I would make. I'd have a Michaeloth out or something, and it would make 6 tokens, and they would get Goblin Bombardment, draw 6 cards, and your first reaction to this card is, well, everybody's drawing cards. Everybody's got creatures, and no, everybody has a few creatures. You can engineer it so that you have a lot of creatures,
yes.
And if you have a lot of creatures, Fecundity is cheap and draws you way more cards than everybody else, and because everybody's drawing cards, it takes less fire than most of those sort of enchantments.
Oh yeah, I mean,
because everybody's like, I can kill this thing, but this guy's gonna die. I'm gonna draw a card off of it. I don't want to kill that.
That's what players' greed gets the best of them, and they suffer things like that and Edric, Spymaster of Trest to live when they just like, well, I want to draw cards too, and that
always kill Fecundity.
Yeah. Sweet. Fecundity is a very sweet throwback pick. My pick is Dross Harvester. It is a 1 black creature that's a horror. It's from Weatherlight. It has protection from white. It's a 4/4, and at the beginning of your end step, you lose 4 life. That would seem like, well, that's a terrible creature. But then the operative is whenever a creature dies, you gain 2 life. And I played this enough times where I put it on the battlefield and people haven't seen it before are like, that's kind of bad. I'm like, okay. Wait for it. And, in Commander, creatures die a lot. And the first time somebody wipes the board, you're going to end up with this giant pile of life. And you're also playing black, so you're going to cycle creatures in and out of your graveyard anyway. And that little kick of 2 life, it adds up and adds up and adds up.
Until somebody plays Sulfuric Vortex and you're really, really sad.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Erebos, God of the Dead, good game.
Yeah. But no, that's a sweet card, because... How big is it?
It's a 4/4.
4/4? For 3?
Or is it a 3/4? Let me double...
No, it's definitely... It's bigger than that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 4/4. But yeah, and even if you play it early, play it on turn 2 or turn 3, you're like, I'll take the hit this time. But then you're getting in with some damage. You're starting your thing where you play your Wood Elves and then sacrifice it or whatever. And like I said, it pays for itself really, really fast.
Plus, you can find ways to abuse that loss of life periodically.
Well, I mean, even if you're not gaining life,
there are cards that will take advantage of that.
Repay in Kind is sort of the poster child for losing a lot of life and not gaining it.
And not caring.
We hope you get some. we hope you get some mileage out of our hidden gems, and of course, the feature will be back next week. Now it's time to move into the chair block, and we're going to build around some Commander's Die triggers. So I think the big 3 cards that people are talking about right now are Child of Alara, The Land of the Dusk Rose, and Roalesk Apex Hydrid. Is there anything else that's hitting your radar?
I mean, the other ones, of course, are the Kamigawa Dragons. Kakusho, obviously, is the sort of famous one.
Right.
Having had many, many different statuses in Commander over the years. Banned as Commander, banned, totally legal, fine, now better.
Now better.
The thing about Kakusho that we got to at this point is that, obviously, if you can make infinite mana, you can win with it. You can do that with many things.
Yeah, there are quite a few cards that... Well, people are like, well, that card's broken because if I just make infinite mana,
you probably won anyway.
Yeah.
So I mean, Kakusho, draining the table with Kakusho is 6 mana, then it's 8 mana, then it's 10 mana,
Right.
and that's still good. I mean, like, it's a 20-point net life swing. If you're more than that, it's, you're gaining 15 life. Each of your opponents is losing 5 life.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good rate, and
Yeah.
it'll keep you alive to get up to there. But we don't think it's game breaking at this time.
No.
The other Elder Dragons, I mean, I'm personally kind of a little bit excited for Jugan as the timmiest of the Elder Dragons.
Okay.
That's a lot of +1/+1 counters to distribute.
Mm-hmm.
So, and maybe Roalesque does it a little better in better colors, but Jugan's a giant dragon, and that's kind of cool. But yeah, I mean, as we said earlier, it's not that there are a ton of creatures out there right now that have these death triggers. There'll be more coming. I don't think that's a spoiler
Right.
in any way, shape, or form, given Watsy's like enthusiastic reaction on Twitter. But yeah, so of the ones that are currently existing, I think Jugan is the one that like interests me the most, just from a giant flying beater that gives everything counters perspective.
Yeah, I mean,
obviously,
go ahead.
no, obviously Yosei is
Ugh.
probably the most obnoxious of
Yes.
them. But it's mono white. It's it's the sort of thing where it's going to be very, very quickly telegraphed whether this is a deck you're going to want to have actually played or not.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, somebody's going to try it. I don't think it'll get there as being better than, I mean, if you're the sort of person who thinks that, repeated Yosei locks is awesome, you're probably already playing Hikori.
Right.
So
Yeah,
that's a thing.
Yosei's the expensive option to do what you're going to do. There are plenty of other ways to do that.
And I'm pretty sure, like, if this was 2004, when I first made my Baron Master Wizard deck,
Mm-hmm.
if the rules were as it was now, it would not surprise me if Kaiga had been the general.
Okay.
Kaiga's a card that's gone in many of my decks. I'm a huge fan of it, obviously. And that's a fair effect for its cost, even repeatably.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even with infinite mana, you're just gaining control of everybody's creatures.
Right.
That's totally fine. That's like the least
Yeah.
horrible use of infinite mana possible.
Right.
But a commander who periodically dies and gives you somebody else's creature is actually kind of a cool build around.
Yeah.
And it's mono blue, so mono blue is perfectly strong and viable on its own. So it would not surprise me if people started rocking Kaiga decks after a bit.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I probably wouldn't mind seeing that. Certainly, rather see that.
No,
I'd rather see that than Yosei.
I would happily play against a Kaiga deck.
And rooting Saurian is a thing.
Yeah, but the ones you're going to see most, you're going to see some Kakusho probably,
Yeah.
but you're mostly going to see Roalesque, Elenda, and some Child. I think people are going to get real sick of Child real quick. Not because it's good, but because the games will not end.
Yeah, I think that the people, it's actually the people that are playing Child are going to finally just get bored with it. It was like,
yeah, no, yes. I mean, it won't be social pressure from other people like, oh, I hate playing your Child of Alara deck, because your Child of Alara, I mean, I've got my Tribal Wrath deck.
Mm-hmm.
It's currently Heliod. That deck's fine to play against. It does mean long game. I mean, I won't pull that out as like game 2 of one of our streams or something, because, oh god. But that one at least just wipes out creatures a bunch, and you can still play Planeswalkers and artifacts and enchantments.
Right.
It'll only occasionally wipe those out. Child is resetting the board, and it's not that that's horrible to play against, because you're not losing. I mean, eventually, maybe they get critical mass of indestructible creatures,
Mm-hmm.
which is the obvious way to go. But most of the time, it's just, oh, we reset again, we reset again, we reset again, and the player playing that's going to be like, okay, this is just not that interesting. So I think there's a lot of initial interest, but I'm skeptical that we'll see a huge surge in Child of Alara. I think we'll see a huge surge in Elenda decks.
Yes.
I think we'll see a few more Roalesque decks and a tiny uptick in Child decks.
Yeah.
And I believe that's most of the current impact on the format.
Yeah. Well, the other big card that folks are talking about, and Command Zone recently did an episode on it, is Rune of the Hidden Realms.
Yep. So when we were building all of these trigger possibilities, or these state-based actions, or we had the list of 8 things. We had a sort of matrix of cards, where we said, well, what happens now with this particular interaction that we care about? And we'd ask things like, well, how does this work with like Last Laugh or If That Betrays or Skullbriar?
Right.
We had Oblivion Ring on the list, and we knew about Oblivion Ring. We actually missed Rune, which is the same effect as Oblivion.
Yeah.
So we knew about the effect. We didn't come up with the fact that there was one commander that had a effectively the same version of that effect, which is a little annoying. I'm kind of sad I missed that one. I don't think it would have changed anything.
No.
The simple answer is that Rune kills your commander. And that's actually an acceptable. I mean, Empress Galena exists in this format.
Sure. Sabo Sabak.
Sabo is expensive, and but Empress Galena works. Empress Galena is I take control of your commander, if I remember correctly. Yes. Yeah. And so having a tap ability to destroy a commander is on a creature that I don't think it has haste or anything. You have to wait. Yeah. So it's got to be played, go around the turret table once, and then you can tap and use it to kill a commander. And frankly, the things that a Rune deck does, you're going to wish it was killing your commander. And this is where I say, if we see that, like, there's this giant uptick of people playing Exile plus Stifle effects to make people lose their commanders, if you're doing that at high-level play with people who are prepared for it and understand, don't really care. It's fine. It's along the lines of the Mindslaver loophole, which I expect we'll talk about in a moment anyway. If we see a large uptick of people doing that to people who are not prepared or are suddenly surprised by the interaction and discover they've lost their commander, we'll look into what we can do about it.
To explain.
Yes.
When you activate Rune and it exiles your commander, you have the choice of leaving it in exile or putting it in the command zone. If you leave it in exile, that means there's going to be a delayed trigger that brings back your commander onto the battlefield at the end of turn. That trigger, of course, can be stifled, which would then strand your commander in exile.
Right. And now, Oblivion Ring as the one-shot version of that, when we talked about it, we're like, well, Oblivion Ring becomes commander removal if you need it to be. Mm-hmm. Or, maybe if you feel like they're not running Stifle effects, it's fine and it'll be okay. Uh-huh. But with Rune, it's more a question of if they're doing it repeatedly. But again, Rune isn't. Rune's already a pretty strong general, and the things it's doing are pretty gross. Uh-huh. It's not like this suddenly went from being a fringe thing to, oh my god, this deck's amazing. Mm-hmm. Rune becomes a commander killer. Don't leave it in exile, folks. PSA.
Yeah. Well, the other person's playing blue. You probably don't. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, if you're playing with your folks that you normally play with, and you know that your friend isn't the type to do that kind of thing, sure. But the safe choice here is just put it back in the command zone, pay the extra 2 to get it again.
Yeah, you're never going to be in a world where if I randomly decide to pick up Rune and I exile your commander, you might have to think about whether the other people might start.
Yeah, I was going to make that same point. You're not the only person at the table. So
yeah, so you have to read the rest of the table. But there's very little chance that I'm going to be trying to exile your commander permanently. Now, the interesting thing is that for Oblivion Ring, Wizards has already figured out a template that works around that.
Right.
One of the reasons we didn't worry so much about Oblivion Ring is that Oblivion Ring has been replaced by the Banishing Light template, and the Banishing Light template doesn't have this problem. Mm-hmm. Banishing Light was one of the cards that we actually quote unquote fixed with this because it had a weird interaction before where you would Banishing Light the commander, and it would you could put the commander in the command zone, and if Banishing Light went away, it would come back.
Right, because there was no additional zone change to make Banishing Light lose track of the commander.
You say that like that's intuitive and makes sense. But yeah, for people who who aren't steeped in these rules, right. That's a really weird thing. When you put it in the command zone, I exiled it. It's not there. It shouldn't be coming back. And you would have to explain you have to basically explain what you just did, and what you just explained still doesn't make a ton of sense for people who aren't really conversant with the rules. Right. So we regard the Banishing Light. Banishing Light now makes you make a choice.
Yeah.
You either leave it in exile and deal with the Banishing Light, or you let it go to the command zone and it's there, and it's effectively been removal. And that's actually a nice strategic decision, because you have to decide, well, can I deal with Banishing Light?
Right.
You know, what's going to happen in the next few turns? Does it make it strategically correct for me to put it in the command zone? Does it make it strategically correct to put it in exile?
Right.
That's actually good.
Yeah, if you're playing a Rakdos deck, you may not have any way to deal with that Banishing Light. So
Right.
you'll want to put your commander back into the command zone so that you can bring it, you can cast it again. Whereas if you're playing Bant and your choice is, you have your Aura Shards and your Reclamation Sage and 19 other things to get rid of enchantments, then you're good.
Yeah, or that other guy over there is playing Trials of Alara. Yeah, so it actually becomes an interesting strategic choice where before you just had to learn the rules quirk and there was always a correct choice to do
right.
it. So the fact that they're using that template a lot more, I mean, it's a really good template. I like it a lot. Because it is just one single continuous effect with an expiration. And the fact that they have been trending towards using that more and more makes me think that they will continue to do so. And those cards will now produce interesting strategic decisions with commander dice triggers.
Yeah, exactly. I think I agree with you wholeheartedly on that whole thing. So what other cards have popped up into your transom here on commander dice triggers that aren't necessarily commanders, but that leverage the commander's dice thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most, well, the weirdest one is Sir Conrad.
Oh yeah,
because Sir Conrad triggers twice.
Yep.
Which is just weird.
Yep.
But that's more a quirk, and Sir Conrad's already pretty gross, and now it's just that little tiny bit grosser. But no, I mean the big ones that were just sort of now your commander dies is that any commander with 1 toughness is a very relevant Skullclamp target.
Yeah, exactly.
That's probably that might be the single biggest one. The other one is Blood Artist gets a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Or any of the sort of when a creature dies, drain you for 1s.
Right. So to explain the Sir Conrad thing for folks, so Conrad will go to the graveyard and die, triggering its own ability, and then when it moves from the graveyard to the command zone as that state-based action, it will trigger again.
Yeah, so you get 2.
Yeah, so you get. I mean, it's just 1 extra. It's it's not like every creature. So
yeah, it's quirky and entertaining. Yeah. It's not going to. It's possibly the weirdest interaction that you'll have to explain now.
Right,
but it's not that big a deal.
Is that the only leaves the graveyard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably on a legendary creature.
Yeah. The one that the card that really
hack on
got it for me is Stalking Vengeance.
Oh god!
Because I play Stalking Vengeance in my Kresh the Bloodbraided deck, and before, if you got rid of Kresh, Stalking Vengeance wouldn't trigger because it replaced the dies. Now, if it dies, now Stalking Vengeance on the battlefield with a Kresh that's full of counters becomes very, very deadly. Or
yes, no, absolutely.
Or more deadly than it used to be, I guess. Are you?
Yeah, so
go ahead.
We'll probably see a little bit of an uptick there, but all these cards that we're naming were really good to begin with.
Yeah.
I mean, cards triggering on dies effects in Commander when you have 4 players usually, and a plethora of master removal and giant board states where suddenly somebody will play something and 20 creatures will die.
Right.
Dice triggers are always excellent.
Yeah.
So from we don't spend a ton of time talking about, well, will this dramatically affect the play of Commander? This was very much in the, it will have little effects on the fringes, make some commanders playable, and clean up the rules weirdness.
Yeah, I guess Blood, Dictate of Erebos and Grave Pact are slightly better too.
Yeah, I mean, but again, these are all cards you were playing previously.
Yeah, it's not like that you're going and finding new cards to jam in because of this.
Yeah, we didn't have to have long discussions over would this dramatically change the strategies of the format?
Right.
Which was nice. I mean, I suppose if we'd gone with the dies redefinition, I mean, there were some definitions there we had to have discussions of. This is a big change. There was one proposal we had where you basically could pay at any time to put your commander back into the command zone.
Uh-huh.
And that one actually worked really cleanly in a lot of ways, but the fundamental problem was that it changed the game of Magic because the correct strategy was not to have your commander in your command zone ever.
Right.
You just left it in your graveyard.
Until you wanted it in the
Until you wanted it back. Because there was no downside to that.
Right.
It would be in your graveyard and giving you advantages. And I remember my argument at the time was, this is Commander. Your commander should be like either on the battlefield or sitting in his command tower waiting to command you. Commander just being strategically correct to be in the graveyard all the time does not sort of emphasize the correct tenets of the format.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are times when you're playing a black deck, especially, that you might want to have it in the graveyard because it'll be cheaper to bring back onto the battlefield from there than casting it from the command zone, or you're about to play a big living death or something. But for the most part, we don't want to leave it there in the graveyard. We want it to be in the command zone to sort of
It should be an interesting strategic choice to leave your commander in the graveyard, not just always the correct play.
Right.
And I know I've had some people talk about the flavor of Commander not being as cool anymore. I'm like, actually, I think this works better.
Yeah.
Because you can characterize it before as just before dying, the commander fled back to his Tower of Solitude.
Right.
Now it's your commander dies and then rises from the grave to fight again.
Right.
I'm like, this actually works pretty well.
There's an inevitability. So you mentioned Jugan the Rising Star. Is that the deck you're building to take advantage of Commander dice triggers?
It'll be Jugan or Kaiga, I think, almost certainly.
We played on the stream last week. A couple of us had made decks. Scott had built a Glenalendra deck, and I had modified my not Glenalendra, Elenda the Dusk Rose deck. That was pretty spicy, it must be said. It was a vampire deck, and I modified a Rowless deck that I already had. And what I was doing with that deck was I was using clones to get the Rowless triggers. So I would clone Rowless, let the clone die, go to the graveyard, get to proliferate, and do the shenanigans that way. Turns out that clones are a good way of just keeping your deck on par with the power level of the decks you're playing with, right? They'll scale to whatever you're playing with. I mean, there's times that I've played with you that I've gone like, Toby, why don't you have anything good to clone?
Just because I played Zedru. I mean, geez.
But and I'm pretty sure in a future episode of the Commander RC stream, we'll probably all four get together with some Commander Dies Triggers decks and see where we can go from there.
I'm playing Skull Clamp as my commander.
It's not legendary. So earlier you mentioned something about Mindslaver. You want to circle back around to that?
Sure, yeah. The Mindslaver loop. Well, people ask about this all the time, which is, this is another one of these weird corner cases where we made it very hard with the tuck rule change for you to permanently get rid of a commander.
Yeah.
The way you get rid of a commander is the command tax. That is the way we want you to sort of deal with good commanders. Is you kill it often enough that it becomes prohibitively expensive for whatever impact it's having on the board. And that's sort of the goal of the flow of commanders, that as the game progresses, the commander comes out, but it gets harder and harder every time.
Yeah.
Now, people have for years looked for ways to say, well, I just deal with your commander once and don't have to deal with it again, and that's not an experience we encourage. We want people to be able to play with the commanders and have that particular piece available, especially since, and we certainly saw when we got rid of the tuck rule, which was the main impediment, people started building around commanders a lot more aggressively.
Which is what we want.
Knowing that you would have it.
Which
is exactly what we
wanted. Anyway.
And so for a long time now, the only real way to permanently get rid of a commander is to use Mindslaver or Worst Fears or the other variants on that, which are gain control of the player, and then you, using their cards or your cards, exile the commander, and then because you control the player, you choose to leave it in exile.
Right.
Now, this is we call this the Mindslaver loophole because you're kind of exploiting a loophole.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't fixed it for a couple of reasons. One is that it doesn't actually come up very often. This is like we were talking about earlier with Rune, which is this occurs in games with people who are expecting it, or this doesn't. First of all, it doesn't occur very often. Like
Right.
I don't want people to go out thinking, oh my God, there's a million people out there who are abusing Mindslaver to do this, because Mindslaver is not a terribly powerful card. It does lead to some fun games. You should play Mindslaver for its wackiness and potential for doing ridiculous things. I got Mindslavered once holding Desolation Angel in hand. That was
that was awkward.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But the point is that, again, in the sort of friendlier, more casual games, most people aren't going to try to actively Mindslaver you, and in the ones where they might, it's probably not good enough. And where they are still doing it, it's a very antisocial play.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot. And again, if we saw like huge upticks of this happening in games more widely, we would address this. The second reason is it's surprisingly hard to. It's not like we can change a word in the rules and it magically works. This is one where the only way to fix this, as far as I can tell, because you control the player, so it doesn't matter if you refer to owner or controller or what else. You can't say, its controller always makes this decision, because the controller is still technically making the decision. You're just telling them what to do.
Right.
So the only way to do it is to literally say, Mindslaver cannot affect the decision of whether you're moving your commander. Like, so we have to actually add an explicit rule that refers to this class of like 3 cards.
Right.
That prevents this thing from happening.
And one of the things we've talked about previously is we don't want to reference cards in specific cards and card names in the rules. People have asked us, well, on off-color fetch lands, why don't you just say that we don't want to do it that way because that adds a granularity to the rules that's unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, we essentially have to explicitly add text in the controlling a player's turn section that talks about commanders explicitly.
Right.
And like I said, if it turns out this is becoming a huge problem, and now that we've talked about it in a podcast, maybe it becomes a huge problem.
I doubt it.
I doubt it. If it's becoming a problem, we will do that.
Right.
But for now, this is one of those sort of corner cases where we want to keep the rules, the additional rules on top of the comprehensive rules, as small as possible. And this is, as I think it's JLK likes to say, the juice isn't worth the squeeze here.
Yeah. I agree with that. Now, some people would go, well, why don't you just ban Mindslaver?
And Worst Fears, and there's a third one.
And again, there's that word "just" again, and it's not that simple. I wouldn't necessarily want to ban a corner case card for one even more corner casey interaction. I mean, like you said earlier, one Mindslaver is fine. It can lead to pretty wacky things. After that, maybe not.
Yeah, I know. I'm a big fan of a Mindslaver appearing at some point during a game,
right?
Because usually hilarity will ensue.
Yeah, I mean, were you at that Pro Tour, or was that before you started in New Orleans? What was that, Halloween 2003? There was, like, Mindslaver was a big card at the Pro Tour, and players were literally getting up and sitting in their opponent's seats to play their turns and everything, and it was chaotic and it was hilarious, but it was that joke that kept getting less funny every time you told it. Eventually it's okay, I get it. You'll do it, and it's fine.
No, I was not there. I've never actually been in New Orleans. It's one of the cities I most want to get to that I haven't been to.
I have opinions on New Orleans. I think that they run contrary to popular belief. So, any last thoughts here on the cards you want to play with the Commander Dice triggers?
No, I think we've covered most of them. I mean, a lot of them are just these cards get very slightly better, and they're all cards you should be playing already.
Right.
Because death triggers are great.
Right. Well, I guess we've been sitting in the command chair long enough, and it's time to wrap this episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please remember to follow, like, subscribe, and ring those bells. We would, of course, hate for you to miss one of our thrilling episodes. Toby, do you want to tell these folks where they can find you on social media?
Easiest place to find me is at Toby Elliot on Twitter. You can also usually get me on Facebook, and I tend to keep my ear to the ground on most of the forums. So if you post on forums, odds are pretty high I've read it.
And of course, I'm on Twitter and Facebook by my name at Sheldon Menery. Please tune into my other show here on Star City Games, Commander Community, with co-host Anthony Alonji every Monday, right here and on YouTube. On Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern in the U.S., you can catch Toby and I, along with Scott Larrabee and Gavin Duggan, on the Commander RC Twitch channel. That's twitch.tv/Commander RC. And then, of course, on Sundays, you can find me right here on Star City Games, writing about the best format in Magic history. As always, I'm Sheldon Menery.